What would you do if the woman hired to save your father's life ended up inheriting his fortune instead? In the gleaming towers of Singapore's financial district, where family dynasties are built on discipline and inheritance flows according to Confucian principles, Richard Tan's secret marriage to his home nurse shattered every assumption about loyalty, love, and the price of loneliness. This isn't just another story about a gold digger and a vulnerable old man. This is the twisted tale of how a deathbed turned into a marriage bed, how healing hands became weapons of inheritance theft, and how a family's grief transformed into a murder investigation that would expose secrets no one was prepared to face. What the coroner's report never revealed was that everyone in Richard Tan's life had a motive to want him dead, including the bride who claimed to love him. The Tan family name meant something in Singapore, the kind of something that couldn't be purchased overnight but required generations to build. Richard Tan's grandfather had arrived from Fujian province in 1920 with nothing but ambition and a talent for numbers. By the time Richard inherited the family business at 45, Tan holdings encompassed shipping logistics, commercial real estate across Southeast Asia, and enough political connections to ensure that government infrastructure projects consistently included Tan companies in their vendor shortlists. At 62, Richard embodied the peculiar combination of traditional Chinese values and Western business sophistication that defined Singapore's elite. He spoke Mandarin, Hokkien, and English with equal fluency. He attended Buddhist temple ceremonies and played golf at Sentosa. His Orchard Road penthouse was decorated with Ming Dynasty pottery and contemporary art from Christie's auctions. He represented continuity with the past while embracing the future, exactly what Singapore's narrative of itself required. But the penthouse that should have been filled with grandchildren and the noise of family gatherings felt increasingly empty. Richard's wife, Margaret, had died 3 years earlier after a brutal 18-month battle with ovarian cancer. Their marriage had been arranged by families who understood that wealth married wealth, duty married duty, and love was something that hopefully developed but wasn't strictly necessary. Over 35 years, they had built something functional if not passionate. A partnership that produced 3 children and maintained the family's social standing. Margaret's death had devastated Richard in ways he hadn't anticipated. She had been the social manager of their lives, the one who remembered birthdays and organized family dinners, and maintained the complex web of relationships that bound Singapore's Chinese elite together. Without her, Richard found himself isolated despite being surrounded by colleagues and employees and the endless demands of business. His children, Marcus, 37, Eileen, 34, and Jonathan, 29, had their own lives, careers, and families. They visited dutifully but briefly, their conversations focused on business updates and superficial pleasantries. Richard could see the calculation in their eyes during these visits, assessing his health, wondering about succession plans, measuring how long until they could claim their inheritance. He understood because he had done the same thing with his own father. It was the natural cycle of wealth transfer in families like theirs. The heart attack came without warning on a humid August evening as Richard reviewed quarterly reports in his study. Sudden crushing pain in his chest, left arm going numb, the terrifying realization that his body was betraying him. He managed to call for his driver, who rushed him to Mount Elizabeth Hospital, where emergency cardiac intervention saved his life but revealed extensive coronary disease that would require ongoing management. You'll need lifestyle modifications, his cardiologist, Dr. Lim, explained during the post-discharge consultation. Dietary changes, exercise, stress reduction, and most importantly, medication compliance. At your age and with your cardiac history, another event could be fatal. I'd recommend hiring a private nurse for the first few months. Someone to ensure you're following protocols, monitoring your vitals, managing your recovery properly. Richard had resisted initially. He valued his privacy, disliked the idea of a stranger in his home, and saw the suggestion as an admission of weakness. But Marcus, his eldest son, had been unusually insistent during a rare family meeting at the hospital. "Father, we need you healthy. The business requires your leadership for at least another decade." Hiring a nurse isn't weakness. It's strategic investment in the company's most valuable asset. Marcus spoke in the language of corporate efficiency that always worked with Richard. The nursing agency sent 3 candidates for interviews. The first was a stern Singaporean woman in her 50s who reminded Richard uncomfortably of the hospital matrons he'd just escaped. The second was a young Chinese woman who seemed competent but giggly in a way that would irritate him daily. The third was Carmen Silva. She was 38 years old, Filipino, with 15 years of nursing experience including 5 years in cardiac care at Singapore General Hospital. Her resume was impeccable, certifications in advanced cardiac life support, excellent references from previous private clients, and a professional demeanor that balanced warmth with appropriate boundaries. She wore her hair pulled back severely, minimal makeup, and the kind of sensible shoes that suggested long experience with 12-hour shifts. "Mr. Tan," she said during the interview, her English carrying a slight Filipino accent that softened rather than hindered communication. "I understand you're not comfortable with this arrangement. Most of my clients aren't initially. They see nursing care as an invasion of privacy. But my role is to make myself invisible while keeping you healthy. You should barely notice I'm here, except when it matters." Something about her directness appealed to Richard's own no-nonsense approach to life. She wasn't obsequious like many Filipinos he'd encountered in service roles. She spoke to him as a professional addressing another professional, acknowledging his discomfort without patronizing him. "When can you start?" Richard asked, making the decision that would ultimately lead to his death. Carmen moved into the guest suite of the Orchard Road penthouse on September 15th, bringing with her a single suitcase of belongings and an efficiency that immediately transformed the household routine. She established medication schedules, prepared heart-healthy meals that somehow didn't taste like punishment, and monitored Richard's vitals with the kind of attention to detail he appreciated in business contexts. The first few weeks were strictly professional. Carmen maintained boundaries with practiced skill, addressing him always as Mr. Tan, keeping conversations focused on health management, and retiring to her quarters each evening after ensuring he'd taken his medications and had everything needed for the night. She was present but invisible, exactly as she'd promised. But isolation has a way of breaking down intended boundaries, and loneliness creates intimacy where none was planned. It started with conversations that extended beyond medical necessity. Richard would ask about Carmen's background, initially just making polite conversation during the meals she prepared. She would answer briefly. She was from Cebu, had a son in the Philippines being raised by her mother, had come to Singapore 10 years ago to work as an ICU nurse before transitioning to private care because the hours were better and the pay significantly higher. "You left your son to work abroad?" Richard asked one evening, genuinely curious about the mathematics of sacrifice that led women to make such choices. "I see him twice a year," Carmen replied, her voice carefully neutral. "It's not what I wanted. It's what circumstances required. He has a good education now, opportunities one couldn't provide in the Philippines. Sometimes love means being absent so that presence is possible in other ways." The answer resonated with Richard more than Carmen could have known. He had essentially done the same thing with his own children, been physically present but emotionally absent, sacrificing relationship for the financial security that made their lives possible. The parallel made him see Carmen not just as hired help but as someone who understood the complicated economics of family duty. Their conversations deepened gradually. Richard found himself sharing more than he intended, talking about Margaret's death, about the loneliness of the penthouse, about feeling like his life had been consumed by obligations that left no room for actual living. Carmen listened with attention that felt genuine, occasionally offering observations that were surprisingly insightful. In Filipino culture, we have this concept called pakikasama, getting along, finding harmony with others even when it's difficult. She said during one late-night conversation when Richard couldn't sleep and had called her from her quarters. "But sometimes I think pakikasama can become a trap. You spend so much time maintaining harmony for others that you forget to ask what creates harmony for yourself." "That's very philosophical for a nurse," Richard observed, slightly surprised. Carmen smiled, a rare crack in her professional composure. "Nurses see people at their most vulnerable. You learn things about human nature that philosophy professors only theorize about." The emotional intimacy preceded physical intimacy by several weeks, but the progression felt natural rather than calculated. at least to Richard, whose loneliness had created blind spots in his usually sharp judgment. A hand that lingered on his shoulder when checking his blood pressure. Conversations that occurred sitting closer together on the sofa. Laughter that came easier as Carmen allowed more of her personality to emerge from behind professional distance. The first kiss happened 3 months into her employment, on a December evening when Singapore's brief cool season made the penthouse feel almost cozy. Richard had been discussing his fear of another heart attack, his voice carrying vulnerability he rarely showed anyone. Carmen had been listening with that particular kind of attention she'd perfected, and when he finished speaking, she'd reached out to touch his face with unexpected tenderness. "You're not going to die, Richard," she said, using his first name for the first time. "Not while I'm taking care of you." The kiss that followed felt like comfort as much as desire. Richard, who hadn't touched a woman intimately since Margaret's death, found himself responding with an intensity that surprised them both. What began that evening transformed their arrangement entirely. Carmen remained his nurse officially, but she became his companion in ways that extended far beyond medical management. She slept in his bedroom rather than the guest suite. She accompanied him to business dinners as his guest rather than his employee. She transformed from invisible presence to intimate partner with a speed that should have alarmed Richard but instead felt like salvation from loneliness. The whispers started immediately among his household staff, the housekeeper, the driver, the part-time cook who came twice weekly. Foreign domestic workers in Singapore formed tight networks where information traveled faster than the MRT. Within days, Carmen's changed status was known throughout the Filipino nursing community, and within weeks, rumors had reached the Chinese family networks that monitored the Tan family's activities. Richard's children heard about the situation through their own information channels. Marcus called first, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Father, I'm hearing concerning reports about your nurse, that the relationship has become inappropriate." "My relationship with Carmen is none of your business," Richard replied, feeling defensive in ways he hadn't since adolescence. "It absolutely is our business when you're making decisions that could affect the family." Marcus's voice carried the presumption of authority he'd been developing as heir apparent. "This woman is half your age, father. She's your employee. Do you not see how this looks? What she might be after. What she might be after. You mean unlike my children who visit once a month to ask about business succession?" The words came out more bitter than Richard intended, revealing resentments he'd been suppressing. The silence on the other end of the call was heavy with implications. When Marcus spoke again, his tone had shifted from confrontation to calculation. "Father, I think we need to have a family meeting, all of us together, to discuss this situation properly." "There's nothing to discuss. Carmen is staying. You'll treat her with respect or you won't visit at all." Richard hung up before Marcus could respond, feeling simultaneously empowered and anxious about the boundary he'd just established. The family meeting happened anyway, orchestrated by Eileen, who had always been more diplomatic than her brothers. She arranged dinner at a private room in a high-end restaurant, neutral territory where public setting would theoretically prevent the worst confrontations. Richard brought Carmen, despite knowing it would inflame the situation. He wanted his children to see her as a person rather than a category foreign nurse gold digger. Carmen dressed conservatively, spoke carefully, and maintained composure despite the obvious hostility radiating from Marcus and Jonathan. Only Eileen showed any warmth, though it was the kind of strategic friendliness that acknowledged Carmen while maintaining distance. "Ms. Silva," Marcus began formally, "we appreciate the care you've provided our father. However, the family has concerns about the nature of your relationship. Concerns about whether appropriate boundaries have been maintained." "Appropriate boundaries?" Carmen's voice remained steady. "Your father is my patient, yes. But he's also an adult man capable of making his own decisions about companionship. Companionship that happens to come with access to a wealthy man's finances and estate planning." Jonathan interjected, less diplomatic than his brother. "Forgive us for questioning the timing and the motives. My children seem to think you're after my money," Richard said bluntly, tired of euphemism. "They believe you seduced a vulnerable old man for financial gain." "And what do you believe?" Carmen asked, turning to look at Richard directly. The question carried weight beyond its simple words. This was the moment where he had to choose between his children's narrative and his own experience of their relationship. "I believe," Richard said slowly, choosing words carefully, "that you've made me happier in 3 months than I've been in 3 years. Whether money factors into your affection, I honestly don't know. But I do know that my children's concern about your motives is entirely financial. They're worried about their inheritance, not my happiness." The accusation landed like a grenade in the middle of the private dining room. Eileen looked stricken. Marcus's face hardened into something cold and calculating. Jonathan simply stared at his plate, unable or unwilling to deny the charge. "That's not fair, Father," Eileen said quietly. "We love you. We want you to be happy. But we also want you to be protected from people who might take advantage." "Then protect me from yourselves," Richard interrupted. "You visit when convenient, call when you need something, and measure our relationship by whether I'm still useful to the family business. Carmen is here every day. She knows my fears, listens to my stories, and treats me like a person rather than an inheritance waiting to happen." The dinner ended badly, with Marcus and Jonathan leaving early and Eileen departing with tears in her eyes and warnings about not letting stubbornness destroy the family. Carmen and Richard returned to the penthouse in tense silence, both knowing that a line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. "They hate me," Carmen said once they were safely in the penthouse, her professional composure finally cracking. "Your children will never accept me. They don't have to accept you. They just have to respect my choices." Richard pulled her close, feeling protective in ways he hadn't since his children were small. "I'm not going to let them dictate how I live the rest of my life." The proposal happened 3 weeks later, on New Year's Eve, as fireworks exploded over Marina Bay and the city celebrated another year of prosperity and progress. Richard presented a ring, not the massive diamond his wealth could easily afford, but a simple gold band with a modest sapphire that Carmen had admired weeks earlier in a jewelry store window. "I know this seems impulsive," Richard said, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since proposing to Margaret 40 years earlier. "I know what people will say, but I'm 62 years old, and I've spent most of my life doing what was expected rather than what I wanted. I want to marry you, Carmen, not because I need a nurse, but because I want a companion for however much time I have left." Carmen's tears seemed genuine, her acceptance immediate. "Yes, yes, of course yes." They married 5 days later in a civil ceremony at the Registry of Marriages, with only 2 witnesses pulled from the waiting room to satisfy legal requirements. No family, no announcements, no wedding banquet with hundreds of guests that would normally mark a Tan family union. Just 2 people making legal commitments that would have consequences neither fully anticipated. Richard felt giddy with rebellion. For the first time in his carefully controlled life, he had made a purely personal decision without calculating its impact on business or family standing. He'd married someone he wanted, not someone his family arranged. Felt like freedom. Carmen seemed quietly satisfied, her professional nursing demeanor giving way to something more openly affectionate. She signed the marriage certificate with a slight smile, her new legal status as Mrs. Richard Tan carrying implications that extended far beyond romantic sentiment. They returned to the penthouse as husband and wife, ordered expensive champagne from room service, and celebrated in ways that made Richard feel decades younger than his medical charts suggested. For 3 perfect days, he existed in a bubble where only their happiness mattered. On the 4th day after their marriage, Richard Tan was found dead in his bed. The housekeeper discovered the body at 7:30 a.m. when she arrived for her daily shift. She had knocked on the master bedroom door as usual to check if Mr. Tan needed breakfast, received no response, and found the door unlocked, unusual as Richard was particular about privacy. Inside, she found him lying peacefully in bed, eyes closed, one arm extended toward where Carmen should have been sleeping but wasn't. The housekeeper's scream brought the building's security guard, who called emergency services immediately. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes but could only confirm what was obvious. Richard had been dead for several hours, his body already cooling, his skin showing early signs of lividity. Carmen was not in the penthouse. Her belongings were gone from the closets they'd been sharing. The only trace of her presence was a handwritten note on the kitchen counter, addressed to Richard. My darling husband, I had to go handle some urgent family business in Philippines. Emergency with my son. I'll be back in few days. I love you. Your wife, Carmen. The note's existence was documented by the first police officers to arrive at the scene. Its casual tone, leaving the country days after marrying a man with serious cardiac disease, would become central to the investigation that followed. Detective Inspector Sarah Ng from the Commercial Affairs Department was assigned to the case not because there was immediate evidence of foul play, but because the circumstances screamed financial motive. A wealthy man dying days after marrying his nurse, who then immediately left the country, triggered protocols designed to protect estates from precisely this scenario. D.I. Ng arrived at the penthouse while the coroner's team was still processing the scene. She was 41 years old, Peranakan Chinese, known for her methodical approach to cases involving Singapore's elite. White-collar crime and inheritance disputes were her specialty. She understood how money moved, how documents could be manipulated, and most importantly, how rich families protected their interests even when it meant circumventing laws designed to ensure fairness. What do we know? She asked the senior investigating officer, a uniformed sergeant who had secured the scene. Victim is Richard Tan, 62, millionaire businessman. History of cardiac disease. Found dead in bed by household staff. Time of death estimated between 2 and 4 a.m. No obvious signs of violence. Wife is missing. Left the country yesterday according to immigration records. Wife. D.I. Ng's eyebrows rose. How long were they married? For days. Married in civil ceremony without family knowledge. She was his home nurse before becoming his wife. The sergeant's tone carried the judgment that Singaporean society would universally apply. Chinese millionaire marrying Filipino nurse who then disappeared after his convenient death. The narrative wrote itself. D.I. Ng spent 3 hours at the scene, examining everything with the thoroughness that had built her reputation. The bedroom showed no signs of struggle. Richard's medications were properly organized on his nightstand, with the evening doses apparently taken correctly. His phone showed no concerning messages or calls in his final hours. The only anomaly was Carmen's absence and the note that seemed almost deliberately casual about leaving a cardiac patient alone so soon after marriage. The autopsy results came back within 48 hours, expedited given the circumstances. Cause of death: acute myocardial infarction, another massive heart attack. Toxicology screens showed therapeutic levels of his prescribed cardiac medications and nothing else. No poisons, no unusual substances, nothing that definitively indicated homicide. But timing and circumstances kept the case active. Marcus Tan hired his own investigator, a former police superintendent who specialized in asset recovery and fraud cases. He presented himself at D.I. Ng's office 2 days after his father's death, dressed in expensive mourning clothes and carrying righteous fury wrapped in filial duty. Detective Inspector, I want to be clear that my family believes my father was murdered by Carmen Silva for his money. We have evidence that she manipulated a vulnerable man, isolated him from family, and positioned herself to inherit his estate. Evidence? D.I. Ng asked, her tone neutral. Or suspicions? Marcus opened his briefcase, extracting a folder thick with documentation. Carmen Silva's real background, not the sanitized version the nursing agency provided. She's been working in Singapore for 10 years, but what the agency didn't mention is that she's been involved in 3 previous relationships with elderly wealthy patients. One died and left her $50,000 in his will. Another divorced his wife and gave Carmen $80,000 before the family intervened. A third fired her when his children discovered she'd been discussing inheritance with him. D.I. Ng reviewed the documents carefully. If accurate, they painted a picture of a woman who had refined a particular skill, identifying vulnerable wealthy men, providing excellent care while cultivating emotional dependence, then converting that dependence into financial benefit. Not illegal exactly, but ethically troubling and establishing a pattern that made Richard's death look significantly less coincidental. Where is she now? Marcus asked. Have you located her? Immigration records show Carmen Silva departed Singapore on January 7th with a one-way ticket to Manila. We've requested cooperation from Philippine authorities, but she hasn't returned to her registered address in Cebu. Her phone is disconnected. Her bank accounts in Singapore haven't been accessed since before your father's death. Because she's running, Marcus insisted. She killed my father and fled. Or she received news of a family emergency exactly as her note stated, and your father died of natural causes while she was away. Diang's job was investigating evidence, not validating family assumptions. Mr. Tan, I understand your anger, but we need proof, not theories. The autopsy shows natural causes. There's no evidence of poisoning or physical violence. Without concrete evidence of homicide, this remains a death by natural causes complicated by suspicious circumstances. What Diang didn't mention was that her own investigation had uncovered complications that Marcus either didn't know or chose not to share. Richard Tan's estate planning told its own story about family dynamics and competing interests. 6 months before his marriage to Carmen, Richard had updated his will. The new version significantly reduced his children's direct inheritance, instead placing 60% of his wealth into trusts that they could access only under strict conditions: completing advanced degrees, working in the family business for 10 years, or reaching age 50. The remaining 40% was designated for charitable foundations that Richard would control until his death. Then, 3 days after marrying Carmen, Richard had visited his lawyer to draft yet another will revision, one that hadn't been finalized before his death. His lawyer's notes indicated that Richard intended to leave Carmen a substantial portion of his estate, along with the Orchard Road penthouse and an annuity that would provide comfortable income for life. The timing was damning for Carmen's narrative of innocent love. She'd married him and he'd immediately moved to give her millions. But it also complicated the family's narrative. Richard's own children had strong financial motives for preventing their father from changing his will. If Richard had died before finalizing the new document, the existing will stood, and Carmen got nothing beyond potential widow's claims under Singapore's intestacy laws. Diang's investigation expanded in multiple directions simultaneously. She tracked Carmen through airline records, discovering that the family emergency claim had legitimacy. Carmen's 16-year-old son had been hospitalized in Cebu with dengue fever 2 days before Richard's death. Medical records confirmed the severity of the situation, supporting Carmen's need to travel urgently. But then Diang discovered something that complicated the narrative further. Carmen had purchased her airline ticket 3 days before her son's hospitalization, before she could have known about any emergency. The ticket purchase preceded both the wedding and the medical crisis, suggesting premeditation of some kind. More disturbing were the phone records. In the 48 hours before Richard's death, Carmen had made multiple calls to a number registered to a Filipina woman named Maria Santos who worked as a domestic helper in Singapore. When Diang tracked down Maria Santos for questioning, the woman initially claimed not to know Carmen well, just an acquaintance from church. But financial records showed Maria had received a $5,000 transfer from Carmen the day before Richard's death, with a memo reading, "Thank you for your help." Help with what? That question became central to Diang's investigation. She brought Maria Santos in for formal questioning, and under pressure, the woman's story began to crack. Maria admitted that Carmen had asked her for help obtaining certain medications, specifically, drugs that could induce cardiac events in someone with existing heart disease. Maria, who worked for a Singaporean doctor, had access to medication samples and had provided Carmen with several doses of a calcium channel blocker that, when combined with Richard's existing cardiac medications, could trigger dangerous heart rhythm disturbances. Did Carmen say why she needed the medication? Diang asked. She said Mr. Tan was having trouble sleeping, that she wanted to help him rest properly. Maria's face showed the realization that she'd been used. I thought I was helping. She's a nurse. I assumed she knew what she was doing. The medication could explain everything. If Carmen had given Richard additional doses of cardiac medication on top of his prescribed regimen, it could have triggered the fatal heart attack that the autopsy attributed to natural causes. It would be nearly impossible to prove definitively. The drugs would be indistinguishable from his legitimate medications in toxicology screens. but it gave DIing enough evidence to issue an international warrant for Carmen's arrest on suspicion of murder. Finding Carmen took 6 weeks. She'd been hiding in a small coastal town 3 hours from Manila, living under her maiden name in a rented apartment that suggested she'd been planning her escape for months. Philippine police arrested her on a Thursday morning as she walked back from the local market, her son holding her hand, both of them carrying groceries for dinner they would never eat together. The extradition process took another 3 months, complicated by Carmen's lawyer arguing that the evidence was circumstantial, that she'd been fleeing grief rather than justice, that Singapore's legal system would be prejudiced against a Filipina defendant accused of murdering a wealthy Chinese man. But eventually, diplomatic pressure and legal procedures aligned, and Carmen Silva was returned to Singapore to face charges of murdering her husband of 4 days. The trial became a media sensation that gripped Singapore for 6 months. Every detail was dissected: the whirlwind romance, the secret marriage, the suspicious death, and most dramatically, the family warfare over Richard Tan's estate. The prosecution painted Carmen as a calculating black widow who had targeted vulnerable wealthy men throughout her career, finally achieving the ultimate score by marrying Richard and then murdering him before he could change his mind about inheritance. The defense presented a different narrative: Carmen as a devoted caregiver who had genuinely fallen in love with a lonely man, who had married him not for money but for the family and stability she'd sacrificed by working abroad. Her son's medical emergency had been real, documented by hospital records. The medication Maria Santos provided had been for legitimate therapeutic purposes, and any overdose was accidental rather than intentional. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Carmen's defense attorney argued during closing statements, the prosecution wants you to believe that Carmen Silva is a monster who seduced and murdered a vulnerable man for his money. But consider the actual evidence. Mr. Tan pursued this relationship. He proposed marriage. He initiated changes to his estate planning. The prosecution's theory requires you to believe that Carmen orchestrated every aspect of a relationship where she actually had the least power. She was his employee, a foreigner in his country, completely dependent on his continued approval. But the prosecution had one more piece of evidence that would prove decisive. DIang's investigation had uncovered something that even Marcus Tan hadn't known. Carmen had been in communication with another Filipina woman in Singapore, a friend named Rosa Mendoza, in the weeks before Richard's death. The message thread, recovered from Carmen's laptop that had been left in Manila, contained damning exchanges. Carmen: if something happens to Richard, do I have rights as wife? Even if family contests. Rosa: under Singapore law, surviving spouse has rights even if no will. Family must provide for you. Could be 40 to 50% of estate. Carmen: even if married only short time? Rosa: yes, law protects surviving spouse, but better if he makes will first. More certain. Carmen: he's going to lawyer this week. Says he wants to take care of me properly. The messages showed premeditation, Carmen researching inheritance law before the marriage, calculating her financial position as a widow, timing her actions to maximize legal claims on the estate. Combined with the medication she'd obtained from Maria Santos, it painted a picture of a woman who had carefully planned her husband's death to occur after marriage but before he could change his mind or his family could intervene. The jury deliberated for 4 days before returning a verdict: guilty of murder, with the finding that Carmen had administered a fatal overdose of cardiac medication with intent to cause death for financial gain. The judge sentenced her to 24 years in prison, Singapore's equivalent of life imprisonment for a crime that had been meticulously planned but left minimal physical evidence. Carmen maintained her innocence throughout sentencing, weeping as she spoke her final statement to the court. I loved Richard. I didn't marry him for money. I married him because he was the first man in 10 years who treated me like a person rather than a servant. Yes, I researched inheritance law, because I was terrified his family would throw me out the moment he died. I wanted to know my rights, to understand if I would be protected. That's not murder, that's survival. But the evidence suggested something darker than survival. In the months following her conviction, additional details emerged that complicated every aspect of the case. Investigation into Carmen's finances revealed that she'd been supporting not just her son in the Philippines, but also 2 siblings, her mother, and had been sending money to fund construction of a house in Cebu, a project that required more money than she could have saved on a nurse's salary alone. Richard's lawyer provided testimony that Richard had expressed concerns about Carmen's financial requests in the weeks before his death. She'd asked for loans to help family members, suggested investment opportunities, and inquired about whether his estate could provide scholarship funds for Filipino nursing students. Not overtly suspicious individually, but collectively suggesting a woman focused on extracting maximum financial benefit from her position. But there was one final twist that emerged too late to affect the trial's outcome. Marcus Tan, the son who had been most vocal about investigating Carmen and who had hired private investigators to build the case against her, was himself under investigation by Singapore's Commercial Affairs Department for embezzling funds from Tan Holdings. The investigation revealed that Marcus had been systematically diverting company money through false vendor contracts for over 2 years, taking approximately $8 million that should have been company assets. His father had discovered the theft shortly before his death. Emails found on Richard's computer showed he had scheduled a meeting with corporate lawyers to discuss serious matters regarding succession and criminal activity within the family business. The meeting was scheduled for January 10th, 6 days after Richard's death. If Richard had lived to attend that meeting, Marcus would likely have been arrested, disgraced, and disinherited. His father's death prevented that exposure and allowed Marcus to continue controlling company operations in the chaos following the loss of the family patriarch. Suddenly, the family's urgent focus on blaming Carmen looked less like justice-seeking and more like deflection. Marcus had arguably the strongest motive for wanting his father dead, not for inheritance, which was already complicated by trust structures, but to prevent criminal prosecution that would destroy his reputation and freedom. DIing reopened that aspect of the investigation, examining whether Marcus might have had involvement in his father's death beyond simply exploiting it afterward. But the evidence trail went cold. If Marcus had played any role in facilitating his father's cardiac event, he'd done so without leaving traces that investigators could find. The medication Carmen obtained remained the most tangible evidence of homicidal intent, and her conviction stood. 5 years after Richard Tan's death, the various players in the tragedy occupied positions that reflected the complex injustice at the heart of the case. Carmen Silva remained in Changi Women's Prison, where she worked in the facility's medical clinic and maintained her innocence to anyone who would listen. Her son, now 21, had graduated from university in the Philippines using money from a scholarship fund that Carmen had established before her arrest, funded by the small savings she'd accumulated before marrying Richard, now managed by a trust that ensured her son's education regardless of her imprisonment. Marcus Tan was eventually prosecuted for embezzlement after DIang's continued investigation uncovered additional evidence that couldn't be ignored. He served 3 years in prison, was released on parole, and now lived quietly in Malaysia, exiled from the family business and Singapore's elite social circles. His siblings, Eileen and Jonathan, had taken over Tan Holdings, implementing reforms that prevented the kind of financial irregularities their brother had exploited. Maria Santos, the friend who had provided Carmen with medication, received a suspended sentence for her role in the death. She continued working in Singapore, but under the cloud of being associated with the case, her reputation in the Filipino community permanently damaged by having helped, whether knowingly or not, in what was widely seen as a gold digger's plot. Richard Tan's estate was eventually divided according to his pre-marriage will, with his children receiving trust-managed inheritances and charities receiving significant portions. Carmen, as a convicted murderer, was legally barred from inheriting anything under Singapore's law that prevents criminals from profiting from their crimes. The Orchard Road penthouse was sold, the proceeds donated to cardiac research foundations in Richard's memory. The case became a cautionary tale discussed in legal circles, medical ethics seminars, and among Singapore's expatriate Filipino community. It raised uncomfortable questions about power dynamics between wealthy employers and foreign workers, about the vulnerability of elderly men to exploitation, and about how grief and financial interest complicate families' ability to seek truth rather than revenge. But the central question remained unanswered. Had Carmen Silva actually murdered Richard Tan? Or had she simply been the convenient scapegoat for a death that served multiple people's interests? The evidence suggested premeditation, the medication, the inheritance research, the suspicious timing. But it was also true that Richard had cardiac disease that could have killed him at any moment. That his children had financial motives for his death. That his own stress over discovering his son's embezzlement could have triggered a fatal event. That Carmen's actions, while morally questionable, might have been driven by survival instinct rather than homicidal intent. In the end, perhaps the truth was more complex than either narrative allowed. Richard Tan had been a lonely man who found comfort with someone who needed financial security. Carmen had been a pragmatic woman who saw opportunity in caregiving and pursued it with strategic intelligence. Both had used each other, he for companionship, she for economic advancement. Neither had been innocent, but whether Carmen was guilty of murder remained a question that evidence couldn't definitively answer. The moral of the story, if there was one, was about the dangers of transactional relationships that pretend to be love. About how money complicates every human connection it touches. About how families that measure their relationships in inheritance rather than affection shouldn't be surprised when their dynasties attract people who value the same things they do. Richard Tan died 4 days after his secret marriage, taking with him the only version of events that really mattered. What he actually wanted, who he truly trusted, and whether the woman in his bed had been his salvation or his executioner. What happens when caregiving becomes calculation, and marriage becomes murder? Sometimes the answer isn't about guilt or innocence. It's about how everyone involved was using everyone else, and how the only real victim was a lonely man who died still searching for connection in a world that had taught him to trust money more than people.